The champagne had barely stopped fizzing when my older brother leaned back in his chair, smiled across the anniversary dinner, and said, "Well, the lake cabin finally belongs to us now." My mother laughed before adding, "Your grandfather always knew you weren't responsible enough to keep it anyway." My sister clinked her glass against his and said, "Honestly, she'd probably have sold it for quick cash." 11 pairs of eyes turned toward me, waiting for the same embarrassed silence they'd seen from me my entire life. Instead, I picked up my glass, took one slow sip, and looked around the table without saying a word. Nobody there knew I'd spent the last 8 months chasing paperwork nobody else cared about. Nobody knew I'd already stood inside that cabin 3 days earlier holding a new set of keys. Nobody knew the framed family photo hanging over the fireplace had never been taken down because I was the one who told the caretaker to leave everything exactly as Grandpa left it. They thought they were celebrating a victory. They thought I had already lost. They had no idea that one quiet sentence was about to turn the happiest dinner of their year into the longest 60 seconds of their lives. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 28, and I work as a project coordinator for a construction company outside Knoxville, Tennessee. My job is mostly schedules, permits, and spreadsheets, which probably explains why I notice details other people ignore. My family likes to joke that I'm the quiet one, but what they really mean is I'm the one who doesn't argue back. Growing up, my older brother Ryan always had the spotlight. He was loud, charming, and somehow every mistake he made became someone else's fault. I was the daughter who showed up. When Grandpa needed groceries after his hip surgery, I went. When the roof leaked during a spring storm, I drove over with buckets before the repair crew arrived. When his memory started slipping, I labeled every kitchen cabinet exactly the way he asked. None of those moments ever made it into family conversations. What everyone remembered was Ryan telling stories at Thanksgiving and my mom calling him the one who keeps this family together. So when Grandpa passed away the previous fall, I already knew what was coming. I just didn't realize how far some people would go once they thought nobody was paying attention, or how one forgotten envelope would change everything they believed they had already won. Grandpa Walter had lived in that lake cabin for almost 30 years after my grandmother passed away. It wasn't a fancy place. The paint needed touching up almost every summer, the dock leaned a little to the left, and the porch steps squeaked no matter how many times they were repaired. But to me, it was the safest place I'd ever known. Every Saturday morning growing up, Grandpa would wake me before sunrise, hand me a mug of hot chocolate, and we'd sit on the dock watching the fog lift off the water without saying much. He believed silence wasn't awkward if you were with the right person. My parents didn't understand that. At home, everything was loud. Ryan was always borrowing money, breaking promises, or starting another business that somehow never lasted more than 6 months. My mother defended him every single time. "He's just taking risks," she'd say. If I questioned anything, I was told to stop being jealous. After college, I stayed close to home because Grandpa's health wasn't as steady anymore. His arthritis made simple jobs difficult, so every Wednesday after work I'd drive 45 minutes to the cabin. I'd mow the lawn, organize his medications, balance his checkbook, and make sure the pantry stayed stocked. Ryan lived 15 minutes away but somehow was always too busy. Sometimes months passed without him stopping by. When he did visit, it was usually because he wanted to borrow Grandpa's fishing boat or ask for another loan he promised to repay. Grandpa rarely argued. He'd simply nod, write another check, and wait until Ryan left before quietly changing the subject. One afternoon while we were replacing broken boards on the dock, Grandpa looked across the lake and asked, "Do you know why I like old wood better than new?" I shrugged. He smiled and tapped one of the weathered planks with his hammer. "Because you already know what it's made of. It survived storms. People are like that too. Don't trust someone because they sound good. Trust the one who keeps showing up." At the time, I thought he was talking about carpentry. Looking back, I realize he wasn't talking about wood at all. During his final year, his health declined quickly. He hated asking for help, but eventually he couldn't drive anymore. I became the one who took him to every doctor's appointment, picked up prescriptions, paid his utility bills online, and handled the endless insurance paperwork. The nurses recognized me by name. The pharmacist would hand me his medication before I even reached the counter. Meanwhile, my family acted as though occasional phone calls counted as devotion. At Thanksgiving, Ryan spent 20 minutes telling everyone how much Grandpa meant to him before leaving early for a football game. Grandpa watched him pull out of the driveway, then quietly asked if I could stay a little longer because he didn't like eating leftovers alone. So I stayed. We watched an old western, played 3 games of checkers, and laughed when he accused me of cheating even though I never had. Before I left that night, he stopped me at the front door and disappeared into his bedroom. When he came back, he handed me a small brass key attached to a faded leather tag. "Keep this somewhere safe," he said. I asked what it opened. He smiled the same way he always did when he already knew tomorrow's answer. "You'll know when it's time." I slipped the key into my purse, hugged him goodnight, and drove home thinking it was probably for an old toolbox or storage shed. I never imagined it was the first piece of a puzzle my family had spent years assuming I'd never be smart enough to solve. Grandpa passed away peacefully just 12 days after Thanksgiving. The phone rang a little after 5 in the morning, and before I even answered it, I somehow knew why the hospital was calling. I drove through the dark with tears blurring the road, hoping I'd get there in time, but I was already too late. He looked peaceful, like he had simply fallen asleep after one of our long talks on the porch. I stayed beside him until the nurses gently reminded me there was paperwork to finish. My parents arrived almost an hour later. My mother cried loudly in the hallway, hugging everyone who walked past. Ryan came in wearing wrinkled jeans and immediately asked one of the nurses how long the hospital usually took before releasing personal belongings. That question stayed with me. Not because of the words, but because of how quickly he asked them. The funeral became another performance. I chose Grandpa's favorite hymns, found photographs from every decade of his life, and spent 2 evenings putting together a display board that made neighbors smile through their tears. Ryan stood at the reception telling stories about fishing trips he hadn't actually taken, while my mother proudly introduced him as Walter's right-hand man. I said nothing. After everyone left, I returned to the cabin alone to make sure the lights were off and the doors were locked. Walking through those quiet rooms without Grandpa felt almost impossible. His reading glasses still rested beside his favorite chair. A half-finished crossword puzzle lay on the coffee table. His old flannel jacket hung by the back door exactly where he'd left it. I stood there for several minutes before remembering the brass key in my purse. I pulled it out, wondering again what it belonged to. I checked the tool shed first. Nothing. Then the workshop. Still nothing. As I walked back into the kitchen, my eyes landed on an old oak cabinet Grandpa never let anyone reorganize. Inside were recipe books, old coffee tins, and family photographs. Behind a stack of cookbooks sat a small locked wooden box I had somehow never noticed before. The key fit perfectly. Inside wasn't money or jewelry. It held a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Grandpa's unmistakable handwriting, along with another smaller envelope labeled, "Open after you speak with Ms. Reynolds." Beneath them was a business card for a local estate attorney named Karen Reynolds. I stared at the envelopes for several minutes before carefully placing them back into the box. Something told me Grandpa wanted things done in a certain order, and I'd learned long ago that when he asked for patience, there was always a reason. 3 days later, our family gathered at my parents' house because Ryan insisted it would be easier than driving into town for everyone. Karen Reynolds wasn't there. Instead, my Uncle David, who had recently become a notary, sat at the dining room table holding a folder. He announced Grandpa had updated his estate shortly before his death. According to the document, everything, including the lake cabin, would go equally to my mother and Ryan because they would preserve the family's legacy together. My name wasn't mentioned once. My mother reached across the table and squeezed my hand with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "Grandpa loved you." This just made the most practical sense. Ryan leaned back in his chair looking almost relieved before adding, besides, keeping property takes money. You wouldn't have wanted that responsibility. Nobody noticed I wasn't crying. Nobody noticed I wasn't arguing. They mistook my silence for defeat. The only thing I could think about was the unopened envelope still sitting inside Grandpa's locked wooden box and the attorney whose name appeared on the business card instead of the man reading a document that somehow didn't sound like Grandpa at all. The morning after that meeting, I called Karen Reynolds before I even left for work. Her receptionist asked for my name, then put me on hold for less than 30 seconds before Ms. Reynolds picked up herself. The first thing she asked wasn't why I was calling. It was, Emily, do you still have your grandfather's envelope? My stomach tightened. I hadn't mentioned an envelope to anyone. I told her I did. She paused for a moment before saying, don't open it yet. Bring it with you this afternoon. I drove straight to her office after work. It was a small brick building across from the county courthouse, the kind of place that still had framed family photos in the lobby instead of modern artwork. Karen greeted me like she'd known me for years. She opened a thick file with Grandpa's name on the tab and slowly slid a copy of a signed will across the desk. Your grandfather prepared this almost 3 years ago, she said. I read the first page twice because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The lake cabin wasn't left to my mother or Ryan. It was left entirely to me. The wording was simple, to my granddaughter Emily Carter, who never forgot that love is measured by time, not promises. Karen explained that Grandpa had personally reviewed the will every year and never changed it. No appointment had ever been scheduled for another version. No cancellation. No amendment. Nothing. I reached into my purse, handed her the sealed envelope, and she nodded. Now you can read it. Inside was a handwritten letter. Grandpa wrote exactly the way he talked, short sentences, no wasted words. He said if anyone claimed I wasn't included in his plans, I should trust paperwork instead of opinions. He told me he'd left copies of everything with Karen because good records outlast loud voices. At the bottom he added one sentence that made my eyes fill with tears, the cabin belongs to the one who kept it feeling like home. Karen let the silence settle before speaking again. Then she explained what she believed had happened. The document my uncle read could only replace the original if it had been legally executed after Grandpa's genuine will. But there was one problem. Grandpa had been hospitalized during the week the newer document claimed to be signed. Karen handed me hospital records showing he never left the rehabilitation center that entire week. Even more concerning, the witnesses listed on the later will weren't employees from her office or longtime neighbors. They were two people nobody seemed able to identify. She looked directly at me and said, Emily, I can't accuse anyone without evidence. But this deserves to be investigated. I asked the question that had been sitting in my head since the family meeting. Can we stop them from selling the cabin? Karen sighed. Eventually, maybe. Immediately, probably not. Probate had already moved forward. My mother had requested a quick sale, claiming the property was too expensive to maintain. The court had approved listing it because nobody had officially challenged the documents yet. The sale was scheduled for a public auction in less than 6 weeks. I drove to the lake that evening and parked outside the cabin as the sun disappeared behind the trees. The porch light still worked because I'd changed the bulb only a month before Grandpa died. Standing there, I realized something. Even if Karen proved the truth later, strangers could own the cabin long before the court finished sorting everything out. I couldn't bear the thought of someone tearing down Grandpa's workshop or replacing the dock we'd repaired together. So I sat in my truck, opened my notebook, and started doing what Grandpa had taught me years earlier. I listed every number I had, every dollar I'd saved, every possible loan I could qualify for, and every obstacle between me and that front door. By the time darkness covered the lake, I wasn't just grieving anymore. I had a plan. For the next month, my entire life revolved around one goal without anyone in my family realizing it. I met with my bank after work, emptied the savings account I'd been building since my first full-time job, and even sold a small piece of land my grandfather on my dad's side had left me years earlier. It wasn't enough by itself, but it gave me the down payment I needed. On Karen's advice, I formed a small LLC called Evergreen Shore Properties so the bidding records wouldn't immediately show my name. Everything was completely legal. The bank knew I owned the company. The county records would eventually show it too. The only people who wouldn't know were my own family, and that was exactly the point. Meanwhile, my mother acted like the money from the future sale already belonged to them. Ryan ordered a brand new pickup truck before the auction even happened. At Sunday dinner he joked about finally having enough cash to buy a fishing boat that actually worked. My mother started talking about remodeling her kitchen, telling neighbors she'd waited years for this opportunity. Every conversation made me more certain I was doing the right thing. The auction arrived on a rainy Thursday morning in early spring. I didn't sit inside the room because I didn't want anyone recognizing me. Instead, Karen hired a licensed real estate agent to bid for Evergreen Shore Properties while I waited across the street in a coffee shop with my phone on the table. Every few minutes a text arrived. Opening bid. Then another. Local investor joined. Another. Ryan smiling. Thinks price is great. My heart pounded harder with every update. The bidding climbed well beyond what my mother expected, and according to Karen later, she looked thrilled every time someone raised a paddle because all she could see was a bigger check. She never imagined one of those bids belonged to me. Finally my phone buzzed one last time. Sold. Evergreen Shore Properties. Congratulations. I stared at the message until the words stopped looking blurry. Across the street I watched my family walk out laughing. Ryan slapped my mother's shoulder and pointed toward his old truck, probably talking about the new one he'd soon be driving. My mother hugged my uncle before climbing into her SUV with the biggest smile I'd seen since Grandpa was alive. They drove away believing they'd won. They had absolutely no idea they'd just accepted my money in exchange for the one thing they thought they'd taken from me forever. The weeks that followed were strangely quiet. I visited the cabin every weekend, changing locks, repairing the porch railing, and planting fresh flowers beside the front steps exactly where Grandpa always liked them. I didn't tell neighbors I owned the place yet. I simply smiled whenever someone mentioned they were glad the mysterious new company seemed interested in preserving the property instead of tearing it down. Karen continued gathering evidence about the questionable will while I waited. Then, 3 weeks before my parents' 40th wedding anniversary dinner, my mother called. Her voice sounded sweeter than it had in months. "Emily," she said, "we've all had a difficult year. Let's put everything behind us. The whole family will be here Saturday night. It'll be nice to celebrate together." Before hanging up, she added one sentence that made me look over at Grandpa's old rocking chair sitting on the cabin porch. "And please," she laughed softly, "don't bring up the cabin. That's settled now." I looked at the framed deed resting on my kitchen table beside the original will Karen had authenticated and Grandpa's handwritten letter folded neatly inside a leather folder. Then I smiled to myself and answered, "Of course, Mom. I'll see you Saturday." She thought she was inviting the quiet daughter she'd spent years talking over. She had no idea she was inviting the owner of the cabin they were still celebrating selling. The anniversary dinner went exactly the way my mother planned until dessert was served. She stood, lifted her champagne glass, and thanked everyone for helping the family move forward after Grandpa's passing. Then she smiled directly at me and said, "At least the cabin ended up with people who'll actually take care of it." Ryan laughed and added, "Emily would have turned it into an Airbnb by now." A few people chuckled. I simply picked up my glass, took one slow sip, and asked, "By the way, who bought the cabin?" My mother proudly answered, "Some company called Evergreen Shore Properties." I nodded, opened the leather folder beside my chair, and placed the deed in the center of the table. "That's my company," I said quietly. Before anyone spoke, I laid down Grandpa's original will and finally his handwritten letter. Nobody reached for dessert. Nobody touched their champagne. Ryan stared at the deed like it was written in another language. My mother read Grandpa's words twice before her hands started shaking. The room fell completely silent. I stood, wished everyone a good evening, and walked out knowing the truth no longer needed my voice because the paperwork had already spoken for me. If this story stayed with you, subscribe for more quiet victories where truth, patience, and evidence always have the final word.